How's it going, everybody? This is Aaron the Pedantic, and today I'm finally getting to the death and dying mechanics video. So we're going to talk about various types of mechanics that handle death and dying in D&D and D&D type games. And I've got some things that I kind of wanted to highlight about what exactly those do, because it is kind of an important thing to have in a game. I'm sure many of you have noticed that whenever there are substantive changes to how the mechanics work for it, that there is a whole different, feeling at the table whenever you are getting in that low HP area. So, there are really some major questions that I feel like are important to ask whenever we're talking about death and dying mechanics. Number one, how does this affect tension in players? Number two, what does this say about the level of power in the game? Number three, how interesting are the mechanics to use? And number four, what do they say about the world we're playing in? So first up, we're going to start with 5th edition. I'm just going to start there because that's a modern thing. People coming to this video, they may be familiar with that. They may not, whatever. So basically the way it works in 5th edition is that if you receive a hit that does an amount of damage that is greater than or equal to your current plus max HP, you're dead. If you get knocked down to 0, you're unconscious. If you stay at 0 and you're not brought up before your next turn, then you have death saves. You get up to 3 death save fails. At 3 death save fails, your character is dead. If you succeed on the death save, then, if you get 3 of those, then you're going to go back to 1 HP and you'll be unconscious for 1d4 hours or whatever. And if you are hit while you're down, it is an automatic critical, and that results in 2 failed death saves. So it is possible to do something of a coup de grace, but one of the things that is kind of often affects the tension in the players, this is when they start feeling something, because a lot of times they're not really thinking about it until boom, they hit it, and it's like, oh, my character could die. But it's very easy to fix in 5th edition because of all of the different healing options that they have, and the fact that, well, if you're brought back up, then you can be brought back down again, and then we can just repeat the process as long as somebody can get to you in time. And there are more people than not who can heal you. And that's the end of that sentence. I made it sound like there's going to be more. There's more people than not who can heal you. So you don't really have to worry about it quite as much. What does that say about the world that you're playing in? Well, I mean, I guess it just says that your characters are pretty tough. They are pretty tough. That's one of the things that a lot of people that like old school stuff, with 5th edition, they tend to have a little bit of, if you were to use those particular rules from 5th edition in an old school game, number one, you're not dealing quite as much damage usually with your creatures if you're dealing in an old school game, because you're not having those all of those actions, and you're just not rolling quite as much dice as a DM. But you're also not dealing in as high number of hit points as you are in 5th edition with old school games. So could you port it over? Probably. The characters would be a lot more survivable. It could be an interesting experiment, I would say. Am I going to try it? Probably not. All right, basic D&D, death at 0, the classic. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, this one is very interesting, because this one, there is no buffer whatsoever. The entire buffer is just the mere fact that maybe you don't get into combat, and maybe they miss you whenever they swing, and maybe they don't do, enough hit points of damage. That's it. That is it. I mean, that does apply to a lot, pretty much all of them, but it is even more strict with basic because of the fact that it's just over. It's binary. What does it say about the world? It means, well, or at least the act of fighting and all that kind of stuff. It means that really up until the moment that you hit 0, that is just a death blow, fatal, every single time. One of the things that I might say is, it's not really a criticism necessarily, is that it's just a difference in thought pattern in how I would like to have these kinds of things portrayed, is that it doesn't really make room for the idea that you could sustain a serious wound, but not die, it makes it hard to kind of show that, because up until that point that you get to zero, usually hit points is thought of as kind of like your luck. You're able to, just dodge the blow, just, parry it, just, shrug it off, not receive that serious of a blow. As we know in real life, if you sustain an injury, it may take quite a while for you to die. It may be that you die from infection after a while. It may be that you die of blood loss and it takes a few minutes. It may be something that happens very quickly, but in basic, boom, it's done. So, I mean, that is something that I think one of the biggest benefits is it keeps your players on their toes big time. Whenever they are playing first level characters in basic, dear Lord, they are anxious whenever there are creatures attacking. If they really care about not having to re-roll a new character, maybe this one happened to have decent stats, and they kind of like the idea of the character, then they may be kind of like, oh, I don't know if I really want to be the first one to walk through this door. I don't know if I really want to be the first. A pit trap could just be the end of you, and that's just not really the case all the time in a lot of games. Is it an interesting mechanic? I mean, it's very simple. It is incredibly simple. It is, you may have to describe really any of these other ones to some slightly greater degree, and it might take a little bit more understanding, but Death at Zero is it's just simple. A lot of us that grew up on video games that were emulating D&D in various fashions, such as Final Fantasy and things like that, we understand that you run out of those hit points, you're dead. That's just it. So it's very intuitive, very simple. It's great stuff. AD&D. So AD&D, you have your death at -10 HP, and you have the bleeding factor. So I mean, if you happen to get to zero, then you're going to start bleeding, and that's going to keep going down until you expire, basically at -10. It gives you a little bit more cushion. It gives those clerics something to do that's not preventative maintenance, I would say. Because remember, as I was saying, whenever you are playing in basic, it's pretty much like, do you have HP or do you not, basically? There is no middle ground whatsoever. So with AD&D, you could potentially have somebody fall to zero. They start bleeding out. The cleric gets over there. They use a healing spell, and they save them from the brink of death. That is something that can happen. That is one of the reasons why I think that AD&D is a lot more survivable. There are some other aspects as well. There's a lot more tactics and stuff involved. But yeah, that is so. What does it say about the world? Things are a little bit more survivable. You're able to actually have a bit of a gradient there, especially considering in the book it says that a character that gets down to, I believe, -6 or so may be considered to have received a permanent scar or injury or something like that. So it's not explicitly written exactly what that's going to be, but it's hinted at. And it's obviously the purview of the DM to introduce that. I like it. I like it a lot. A lot of people actually hate dying at zero because it's so sudden. It's just so quick. And they feel like, they're just throwing characters at a meat grinder. Is that always how it works? No, not really. In my basic game, people got to level 7 pretty well. And from there, it was looking like they would probably just keep going unless something terrible happened. But yeah, you get a little bit more cushion there. So there is, now I'm bringing up some OSR stuff. In basic fantasy RPG, it is Death at Zero, but there is in there a suggestion, or at least an option to involve this mechanic, which is you do a save versus death ray whenever they get to 0 HP or less. And if they succeed, then they get 2d10 rounds to have somebody bind their wounds, or they die. So it gives a lot more opportunity for characters to survive. Now, there is something inherent here. We're involving more mechanics. So we're building mechanics upon mechanics. Whenever it's just based on HP, that's one thing. But whenever we're bringing saves into it, that's another. Because, as most people should know, basic fantasy RPG, it uses very stuff that is very close to the old school save system, which is basically you have these different saving throw types. And as you progress in levels based on your class, you don't have to roll as high. So what does this mean? This means that whenever you're a low level character in basic fantasy RPG, if you were to implement this rule, then that means you may have a 25% chance of surviving this hit. That's not very much. It's not very much at all. And that is, again, it's still going to be fairly meat grindery, but it's still something. It is still something. It gives them a slight chance. Whenever you get to be the higher levels, though, that may be something more like you only have like a 20% chance to fail, depending on what your class is and depending on how high level you are. It can get pretty nutty. You really might just keep on keeping on. There's nothing really there as to injuries or anything like that. That's really, I think that the old school spirit has always been for that to be something that you either just add on your own or something of that nature. How do I feel about that one? I think that is a great middle ground compromise. I do think that it could be kind of frustrating whenever you get to those higher levels, but I don't think most people play at those higher levels anyway. So maybe you put a cap on it. You say, well, it's going to be a death save versus death ray up to, with I don't know, a -2 penalty or something like that. So that way it never gets to quite those extremes. You could do a lot of things. I think it's a neat idea, but I don't know how I feel about it at higher levels. We'll see someday. Okay, another common OSR rule. This is something that's featured in a lot of OSR products, such as Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Lion and Dragon. There are others. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. But this is basically that you're going to be dying at some negative HP, and that there are different kind of stages of how you die. There are probably bleeding out rules. It probably says something about what exactly you're capable of doing. And what I mean by that is that you basically may still be able to communicate. You may still be able to talk. Sometimes you may receive a death blow. It cannot be cured by magic, but you can still get your last words out. All those kinds of things can be different gradients that people can involve in their games. And I like that because it gives you an opportunity to just think about what's important in your games. Is the last words of a character in my old school Essentials game that I was running, that was a public game that was primarily just dungeon crawling, is that really going to be important? Not really. And not except for just for them to give a final screw you to the monsters, or just reveal I don't know where they buried some treasure so that one of the other players can find it. The other player characters can get it, or to say who the inheritor of their will is going to be, since wills used to be a big thing. I like it. I think that it especially makes more sense if you are doing a game that has more emphasis on the characters being important in that way, rather than focusing on the world and challenges and all those kinds of things. Also focusing on social interactions between the players and all that kind of stuff. That's whenever that kind of stuff can be a little bit more interesting. So we also had roll on a chart at 0 and possibly die and probably get at least seriously injured. These can look like a lot of different things. One of the things that immediately comes to mind is Esoteric Enterprises. Now, just full disclosure there, they do have a separation between HP. Well, basically, there's flesh and there's grit, if I remember correctly. And grit is your abstract HP, your ability to avoid getting hit. Flesh is you getting hit. And then from that point, once you get to 0 flesh, you're rolling on a chart. And it keeps on getting worse and worse the higher that you roll in the chart, all the way up to instant death. And there may be different variants of that based on what kind of attack it is. Did you get your head blown off? Did you get your heart ripped out? Did you get your arm chopped off and you're bleeding to death? All that kind of stuff could be on there. I really love stuff like this just because I love to have that kind of codification of those kinds of effects in a way that you might otherwise get from like Warhammer or something like that. Um, but that's because I think that players should be cool, and I feel like I am cool with playing a character that is seriously gone through some crap like that. Maybe they're suffering more than just physical debilitations. Maybe they are suffering from insanity of various types. That's kind of stuff that I like to deal with whenever I'm playing in games, and I like to have those kinds of things be reinforced by mechanics. You could always just make rules, just make a ruling. But I think that whenever you have that codification, it takes out, your partiality as a DM, and it makes it a little bit cooler. And, this is the thing that we rolled. Okay, DCC. So, I mean, this is, for those who don't know, if DCC is an old school style, third edition OGL product that's scaled things back massively into being more of an old school game. It has some crazy, wacky charts that handle critical hits and all that kind of stuff. But interestingly enough, the whole way that it handles falling to 0 or negative HP is you just collapse. Nobody knows exactly how seriously you were hit until they roll your body over, and then you make a luck check. If you pass you as in the player character who is fallen passes the luck check, then you just sustained a wound, and you're going to have some kind of decrease to one of your ability scores. It's permanent, so it's going to affect you, but it's a lot more survivable. There's not a countdown or anything like that, except for that if somebody can get to you before, I believe it is your level in rounds. Somebody could correct me. It's been a while. And usually it doesn't matter that long. They usually die anyway. That is it. And they heal you before then you don't have to worry about the luck check. So what that does is it involves another stat, a luck stat. This is one that's rolled on 3d6. And the thing that's interesting about that is that you're going to have some serious variations. Some characters may have piss poor luck. They may have rolled up a 5 on their luck. So that means that they have a very, very, very poor chance of surviving that luck check because they have to roll a 5 or below. Whenever you're talking on a D20, whenever you're talking about your ones that rolled an 18, they're going to be fine for a long time as long as they don't burn their luck. So how do I feel about that? I feel like it's kind of wild, kind of wacky, maybe a little bit too wild. Just me personally, my own personal opinions on that. There are ways to bypass the luck check if you're receiving a critical hit from a monster. Those can be instant death. There's no question. You're dead. Boom, gone. But how often is that going to happen? It may happen once a campaign or something like that, depending on how long your campaigns are. Because you have to have a monster that is big enough to do that kind of critical hit. It's for them to deliver the critical hit and for them to roll high enough on the critical hit chart to cause that kind of damage. So it is kind of wacky. It is kind of unpredictable. That is, to me, the downfall of it. On the upside, it's fairly simple and it's kind of interesting because it involves this new luck system. And there's a lot of other stuff that you can do with that luck system. So just something for you to think about. We have another common house rule that I saw in the comments on the posting that I made, which was death at negative con score, which is kind of in the same camp for the most part. Did you roll a crappy con? Did you roll a great con? You may be able to take a up to negative 18 as far as that goes. You might die at negative 18, but you may only have 9 points of HP because maybe you're a fighter. Actually, so if you had an 18, maybe you're a fighter and you rolled a 5 on your D8 hit points. Then you have so much negative HP, it's kind of crazy. It is kind of crazy, but The idea would be that you're unconscious and bleeding out, I would assume, is how that would work. I again, it kind of comes with the same thing. The whole thing about all of these that involve those stats that you roll a 3d6 to generate is that you're probably going to get something towards the middle. So you're probably going to get something around a 10 and 11, somewhere in that area, maybe a 9. But there will be the occasional fluke that's just kind of out there. And whenever you have a very low con score, let's say you have a 3, then you're already getting -3 on each of your level ups as far as your HP goes. So you're probably, if you're a character that doesn't, that's not a fighter, or you just roll very poorly, then you may only be getting like 1 HP per level up, and you're going to die -3. It is what it is. It totally is what it is. But at the same time, I don't know how I feel about it. I'd like to hear some more thoughts about what you guys think about all this stuff. What the biggest thing for me is when the players feel tension. Is Those are the things that really matter to me. Whenever I'm playing BX, the players really feel tension the most whenever they are at their last hit die of HP, or maybe they're second to last. It depends on what they're fighting and if there's some kind of critical hit table, not table, critical hit rule. Generally, there isn't in basic, and for good reason, because you can get wiped out seriously quickly if you're doubling the dice or doubling the damage or something of that nature. But just that not knowing if this is going to be the one that kills me every single time, just about you are attacked, is a huge deal. Whenever we're playing something like 5th edition, they generally don't seem to be that worried. It's just kind of like, they might start worrying whenever they get down to their last hit die or so. They may be like, guys, I'm only at like whatever HP. Can somebody like maybe heal me or something? But how worried do they really seem? Not terribly. There's usually a lot of safeguards that prevent them from being too terribly worried until they're downed. And even then, it's a question of what kind of DM are you? Because some DMs will say, this creature's not going to attack a downed opponent. They're going to focus on the other ones. There are legitimate reasons that people might say that. But there are also legitimate reasons that someone might say, well, this is a world that people probably know there are those who can bring you back from the brink of death. And maybe they have been in experienced situations that happened. In that case, maybe they know that the best thing to do is just deliver a death blow while you can. Just make sure that they're gone for sure. Whenever I'm thinking about if I were on a battlefield, and this is me, keyboard warrior, I've never been involved in any kind of deadly encounter of this nature, but I feel like if I was on a battlefield, if I can down somebody and it looks like they might be bleeding to death, but I'm not sure, I feel like I might just go ahead and run them through real quick, as long as I'm not being attacked by something else. I think those are the things to consider. You're probably going to have to think about those things, and it's always hard because you also want to make sure that your partiality is not coming out as a DM. You want to try and make sure that you're being impartial and that you're not just justifying the thing that you want to happen, basically, whether you want them to die, please, for the love of God, or if you're wanting them to survive because they love their character and you don't want to hurt their feelings. So I think that is really the biggest thing for me, is when do you start feeling the major tension? So we've got some comments, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see those comments. These were some comments on the post I did. So you can actually see I did a poll if it would stop lagging. And most people said that they were interested in Death at 0. I don't know if I could have kept on adding options. I think I could, but I'm used to Twitter where I can only do 4. So I had Death at 0. I had Death at negative number equal to level. I had save versus death ray or poison at 0, or dying at -0, instantly dead at -6. And here are the results. So over and all, people preferred, out of these options, death at 0, 46%, which is a pretty sizable portion. Whenever we're talking about negative HPs, it looks like people preferred negative equal to level, which is pretty tough in most D&D games, because of the fact that we rarely, and I say we, but as far as my experience has been, we rarely like to go beyond like level 10 or so. So remember, in AD&D, you can get to level negative 10 and then you die. So AD&D would actually be a little bit more nice when it comes to this. Save versus death ray got a 17%. So a lot of people thought that was pretty neat. And dying at less than 0, but instantly dead at -6 got 16%. So there was a decent amount of love for that. And I want to say that that's probably some of the Lamentations fans out there. All right. So some of the comments here. We have Dark Knight saying he likes -6 because you start bleeding out at that point. The human body has about 5 pounds of blood. When you go into shock, you lose blood fairly fast. So every round you lose 1 pint of blood, which is 1 HP. When you drop to -6 HP, you have no more blood left in your body and you die. I don't know if that's exactly how that works, but I'm not a doctor, and whatever. I like the mechanic, and it sounds good to me. Sure. So Coco B Gorilla says, I like a single death save at the end of whatever situation that caused the 0 hit points. It adds drama for everyone at the table when that roll is made. This is my experience as well. Whenever I've instituted that kind of thing. I believe the characters are made of sterner stuff than a commoner who doesn't adventure into the dungeon. Through fate, strength of will, or just plain luck, they might still survive. This is, this is again something. What does this say about your world? I tend to think of my basic D&D characters as a little bit more disposable. This says maybe not quite as disposable as you might think. PDX GearCon says, I like a bleed out mechanic where you lose 1 HP per round. My old 2nd edition group bled to death at -10 and stabilized at 1. Current Sword and Wizardry uses negative con by popular demand with stable incapacitation at 0. My initial rule was negative level. Okay. So Fiore says, it depends at the moment. I'm liking a singular save versus death. It's sort of the compromise between the finality of death at 0 and giving the characters an extra edge. That being said, negative equal to level would be my secondary for games with a more heroic feel, or if you have new players that don't have quite a grasp on all the usual strategies to survive longer as low-level characters. Yeah, I agree with that to a very large extent. Let's see. Taffer's Tower says, I have a house rule. Roll under con score, adding to the roll any damage below 0. Failing is death. Success is permanent injury. -1 ability score determined randomly, and bleeding out for 1d4 rounds. This is what I love, is that you can often customize death and dying rules, and it doesn't have a huge impact on everything else as far as the system goes, but it has a huge impact on how everybody feels about their characters and their rates of survival, obviously. Iran says, death at 0 is the classic. It's not legit back in the old days before y'all were born. True. Before we did death at -10. I've grown to despise negative HP over time. Death save works for me too, but no stats should ever add to it, except maybe a magic item expressly made for it. And even then, it should be very rare and consumed in its use. I'd consider that an adequate compromise. Sequoia says, for old school classic fantasy dungeon crawling, definitely death at 0 HP. Yeah, I really do feel that. I feel like whenever I'm doing AD&D stuff, I'm going to be wanting that to be, yes, classic dungeon crawling, but also the idea of a more grand scheme adventure type thing. What I mean by that is that the characters, we're going to be looking at them surviving for longer periods of time, which means there could be greater investment in them. Honestly, AD&D takes a little bit longer to create your characters. So not a whole lot, just a little bit. Okay. Narratively, let's see. It balances the unrealistic amounts of treasure being doled out. Narratively, it emphasizes the danger of the dungeon and any combat, creates the stakes necessary for proper catharsis later. Rolling Thunder in a Downpour says at like unconscious at 0 and death a negative. You're at negative your level, losing 1 HP per round unless healed. My second choice would be dying at 0, dead at -6 or even -3. I feel this is a little bit more interesting and adds some tension to combat. Mike says, I got used to death at -10, but when I first played, you were dead at 0. I like the new death save mechanic, but I do not think it should reset. That's another thing. The in 5th edition, the death saves reset basically when the encounter's over, which is something that a lot of people house rule against for good reason. I've done it before. It made had a fly. It got away. I'm going to go after that fool. It made them a lot more tense. It made things a lot more tense. Let's see. Oh, so many. OGGM says, stupid fly. Lose 1 HP around dead at -10 was 1. I do like the death mechanic for 5e, though it needs some tweaks. I use your out of 0, and they have 3 rounds to stabilize you or you're dead. Fair. Doof says, I don't know, to me, death saves, negative HP, etc. only move the tension further away from play. It would do that. Some people like to not have to worry quite so much about the survivability of their characters, and they want to get a little bit further. Some people I've heard just call old school D&D first level BX to be just a meat grinder, and that's all. That hasn't been my experience, but okay. First levels, yeah. It is kind of a meat grinder, but it's not a perpetual one. It is possible to get through it. Let's see. Shock Taupe says, I like roll on death and dismemberment at 0 with at least 50% of the table being instant death. Yeah, and gory descriptions thereof. Alex says there's a finality of death at 0 that I'm quite fond of. No waiting on death's door or yo-yoing, just the big end. Yes. Lynchpan says he's always used death at -10. Need More Cowbell says critical hit for 0 or less with the minus HP added to the roll. Arms broken or taken off at the elbow, broken ribs or vertebra, etc. Not fixable unless you see a real doctor perform surgery, and you'd better hope he used alcohol to sterilize his instruments instead of drinking it. That is some grim, dark stuff. John Harrison says unconscious at 0, roll under con score to stabilize. Yeah, again, you kind of get to the if they happen to roll an incredible con score, which I have seen happen, they may be living for quite a while. And Travis Miller, dear friend of mine, says, I used a death and dismemberment table, so none of the above. All right. Well, I hope y'all had fun. Hope you learned something. I definitely learned a lot from y'all's responses and from, I don't know, taking time to think about it, I guess. So y'all take it easy. It's been a pleasure. And I guess that's it.